What does Paul say in 2 Corinthians 11 verse 28? That the care or the deep concern for all the churches cometh upon me daily. As a huge burden. There he is, thinking of all the churches that have been founded in the last few decades. The whole Catholic Church of his day was a burden upon him. For he was a wise master builder, the chief apostle in terms of inspired writings in the New Testament to the churches, and every day he had this concern upon them. And it's a wonder that the man wasn't crushed, especially if you think of the sins and weaknesses of which he was only too well aware in these churches. And Philippians isn't one of the bad ones. You should read 1 and 2 Corinthians. And I don't want to belittle any of the hardships in any of our lives, but it's a fair enough statement that compared to Paul's difficulties, we hardly know we are living. But then it ought to be added too, that since the apostle was a giant in the faith and we're much weaker, our struggles, though smaller, are only too real and very tough for us. And the other point I should make from this is that this fits Paul as a man and as a Christian teacher to be our teacher in this respect. He tells us, do not worry. That's the chief command of the verse. Here's a man who knows the temptations, experiencing them far worse than we do, with never a day of let up, and by God's grace he knew, not only by inspiration but in his own experience, the way to overcome it, and he did overcome it. And we all find it easier to listen to a man like that, who knows what he's talking about and who practices what he teaches, and we are listening. Which brings us, of course, to this. What are the things that make us worry or tempt us to be anxious? And here, of course, we could make a list as long as your arm. And it will vary from person to person and situation to situation. One factor, of course, is health issues. Your own or somebody else's, particularly those closest to you. The approach of old age and death. And all of us have to think about that too. Children are another thing, I would say, that would feature largely in matters that make people worry, even outside the Christian church, but especially perhaps in it. The inability to have any. Or if you're pregnant, you wonder, what if somebody's going to be wrong with the child? Could I cope if, for instance, God gave us a disabled child? You can't help but think things like that. Then if you see your children straying spiritually, showing very little interest in Jesus Christ, then you're concerned, very concerned. If your children are older and have gone astray and have already left the church and are wallowing in the world, that hits you too. Then there's the question who your children are going to marry. Finding a godly spouse isn't easy. And of course that's a concern for the children themselves. And then when you do find somebody, you're wondering all the while in the relationship, what does my boyfriend think of me? What does my girlfriend think of you? How is this thing going to work out? Or if you're not dating, then you're wondering, why does nobody ask me out? Is there something wrong with me? Maybe my looks aren't good enough. All these things crowd in and make us worried unless we are careful. And if we turn our thoughts to jobs, you'll see there's a whole mountain of it there too. If you're unemployed, you're worried about getting a job. If you've got a job, you're worried you might lose it. And if you're not worried that you might lose it, you've got all sorts of problems at work. And there are all sorts of other problems. Problems with your neighbours, problems with your car, problems with your computer, problems with members of the wider family circle. You've got exams coming up, you've got deadlines coming up for this and that. And then maybe some other even more foolish anxieties. How am I going to keep up with the neighbours? All sorts of silly things like that. That's one of the worst ones. And then there are bills to be paid. And if you're not struggling to pay bills and you have a bit of money and you're making some investments, then you worry, what if my investments fail? So you can never seem to avoid it. And then if you shift a little from things that immediately press upon you, you've got the future. Oh, there's a ton to worry us about the future. If you're going to make some very big steps in the days ahead, life-changing decisions, what's going to happen, my unconverted friends and family, if they stay unconverted? Then, as you think about biblical eschatology, you wonder, how am I going to fare? How are my children going to fare as the apostasy deepens and persecution comes closer and closer to home, and when Antichrist rears his ugly head? And then you think, widening it out a little, what's going to happen to church with the love of many waxing cold and the squash on to be conformed to this present evil age, and the battle to maintain the doctrine, sacramental oversight and discipline of the church? Or coming even nearer to home, maybe some fears or concerns with financing the church building in its entirety. And allied to these concerns about things and events and people, we have, as Christians, sometimes extra anxiety because of guilt. That makes you worry too. You've indulged in some particularly gross sin, and you're afraid that one day it will come out and other people will find out about it. Or you've told some lie, and you feel that you can't own up because the consequences would be too great, and you're worried and anxious and don't know what to do. In fact, and it would be easy to continue in this line of thought, in fact, you can worry and you can be anxious over well nigh anything and everything. You can be worried from the rising of the sun onto the going down of the same, and you can even be worried in your sleep. And you can dream about your worries, especially because dreams come, as Solomon puts it, through the multitude of matters. And you can worry about the big things, the little things, and all things. Isn't it so? And then, of course, you can even worry about being worried. And on it goes. The mind is a labyrinth. Well, what does our text say? Be careful for nothing. Be anxious about nothing. Don't worry about anything. Anything at all. It's entirely sweeping. It doesn't say, but there's one thing you can worry about. You can worry about churchy things. You can worry about biblical issues. No, you don't worry about them all.